Hi, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in tonight and joining us for this program. We're recording this event right now, as you may have heard, and it will be available on our website, the Western North Carolina Historical Association's website, hopefully within a week, in case you missed anything or if you just want to rewatch. Um, we greatly encourage you to ask questions throughout tonight's event. There will be a Q&A feature here at the end of the webinar, so please chime in with the Q&A feature throughout, and we'll get to your questions here at the end. We never get through all of them, it seems, but we'll try our very best. Again, we're all here to learn, so feel encouraged, feel free to ask. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name is Trevor Freeman, and I'm the Public Programs Director here at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. As many of you are probably aware, tonight's event is part of a larger lecture series, and this is the first event. Each month for the next 6 months, we will have a speaker or speakers who are experts on various topics about Western North Carolina, the region we call home. These programs range in their content, but are designed to provide an introduction or sometimes specific details to certain parts of our history and culture. The various people and the places that make up the region we call home are all featured in this series. We're very excited to dive right in. Tonight's guest is Peter Koch, the education specialist at the Mountain Heritage Center at Western Carolina University, where he conducts numerous outreach programs discussing the history and the people of the region for young learners. Peter has a MA in public history from NC State University. He's president of the North Carolina Museums Council and serves on the Western North Carolina Civil War Roundtable and Civil War Trails boards. Peter is here tonight to kick off the series with a discussion of the settlement of Western North Carolina. And so, Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for hosting this series. It is indeed quite an honor to be part of this. There are an amazing number of really good speakers coming up, including a colleague of mine, Dr. Ben Steer from Western Carolina University. I'm going to be running a PowerPoint, so let me pull that up right now. Oops. I can hit the right buttons. There we go. I've been at the Mountain Heritage Center for quite a number of years. The Mountain Heritage Center was actually founded in the 1970s by the chancellor at the time, Cotton Robinson, H.F. Robinson, who some of y'all may have heard of. For much of that time, we were housed in the HFR building, the big white building, right when you come onto WCU's campus. About 6 years ago, we moved up to Hunter Library, to some space in there. We have slightly smaller galleries now, but we've been able to kind of change our outlook. We're in the heart of the students at Western Carolina University, which we think is pretty interesting. So our location has changed, but our mission really has not. And part of our mission is to create a bridge between the university and the larger community. So we actually have quite a number of programs and exhibits and events that take place across the region. Let's see. And this is just a brief sampling of some of the things that we're doing. Coming up this year, we're hosting a Smithsonian exhibit entitled Roots of Wisdom, Native Knowledge and Shared Science. Where at the same time, we're going to be hosting an exhibit called River Cane Renaissance that looks at the river cane plant species that is indigenous to the region and was pretty important for the Cherokee people who lived here for hundreds and thousands of years. We are hosting Mountain Heritage Day again come September. We had to put it off this past September, obviously. And we'll be hosting an exhibit on a woman who spoke just this past week to the same group, Ann Miller Woodford, the artist and storyteller. But like I said, we're out in the community as well. We've got changing exhibits, or we've lent exhibits to a number of different institutions. So you never know where you might see some of our work, some of the work of the students that we help give internships and work study opportunities to. Let's move on into the topic, early settlement of Western North Carolina. Um, I'm going to talk about migration to Western North Carolina and sort of the building of the region. And I'm going to focus especially on transportation within the region all the way up to about 1900, because that's kind of important and laid the groundwork for where we are today in many ways. One of the groups I'm going to talk about in particular are the Scots-Irish. And as you can see from my slide, there's a lot of different names that have been applied to these people: planters, Ulster Scots, the Irish, Scotch-Irish, Scots-Irish is one we often use these days. Some of these names have been applied to them. Some of these names they've actually called themselves. And we may get into that a little bit later on. I don't really subscribe to the great man theory of history, but in this case, this guy had a lot to do with this story. He's James I, King of England. Before that, he was James VI of Scotland. I love this portrait. It's just fancy man wearing a whole lot of fancy clothes. King James had a problem. He came to the crown of England at a time when there was a lot of religious strife in the British Isles. And part of that had to do with Protestant versus Catholic, of course. He wanted to subdue Ireland. Basically, he wanted to keep control over Ireland. And the idea that he and some of his people had was to take people from lowland Scotland and northern England and move them over into Ulster, or what we know of today as Northern Ireland, and to set them up on farms there and to basically pacify the region. Oops. And so over the course of the 1600s, many thousands of people moved over there to Ulster. And they lived reasonably comfortable lives. Many of them were tenant farmers. They were working for English landlords. They grew oats, they grew barley, they manufactured various kinds of liquor. They kept a lot of cattle, so there was a lot of dairy in their diet. And they also grew a lot of flax. And flax was a big business back then, used to make linen cloth, which was used for clothing and other goods. And flax is a fairly intensive crop. You grow it, you cultivate it, you grow it, you harvest it, and then you actually put it into a pond or a bog and you let it set for weeks or months. And this process is known as retting. And after it's retted for a while, it's broken down. To get the fiber to make the linen cloth, you need to break down the outer husk, and retting helps with that, and also pounding it in various types of mills, either in people's houses or like in my picture, a kind of more industrial setting. And once you break it down and you can get all the fuzzy stuff out of the inside of the stem, you can spin it into yarn, and then you can weave it into cloth. And here's some photographs from the late 1800s of the weaving that took place. And this was often either done in some sort of proto factory buildings, or it was also done in people's homes. But again, it was a pretty big business, and there were a lot of people involved in making linen. I love these pictures. They're so instructive as to people's lives and the workings of the machines. And fortunately or unfortunately, I'm going to use a lot of photographs in my presentation, even though for the most part, I'm talking about life in the 17 and 1800s. There's still photographs from the late 1800s and early 1900s that I feel are pretty instructive and will help explain some of the things I'm talking about. By the 1700s, after people had been living in Ulster for 2, maybe 3 generations, folks began to start looking at America as a way to move on. Life in Ulster was fairly fraught at times. There was conflict. The Catholic were not going away. They were not necessarily being subdued like James I hoped they would be. Economics were sometimes bad. The linen crop could get a lot of money, or it may not get much money at all. So maybe there was a better opportunity to be had across the ocean in America. Um, and I'm very interested in this clipping from a newspaper from 1730s. The ship Waddell, burthen 450 tons, William Reed, master, will clear to sail the 10th of October next. Those who mean to take passage as servants or passengers are to agree with Matthew Ray, Dumbo, or Waddell Cunningham of Belfast. So taking ships to America, taking transit to America was fairly big business. There were a lot of people involved in that transit. And over the course of the 1700s, possibly close to 200,000 people left Ulster and came to America. Here's an image. The line drawing is actually Catholic people leaving, but it gets the idea that there were families that came, there were congregations, there were towns, there were different types of groups that would come across from Northern Ireland to America. And then we have this wonderful tombstone, which is from Pennsylvania. I think it's just outside Philadelphia. Born on a ship in the year 1730. Born upon the sea near the Pennsylvania shore. Lived in America till almost fourscore. Happy the man who lives now in, or whose sins are forgiven by our Redeemer who now lives in heaven. So wonderful story, I believe. Mom and dad presumably got onto a boat, baby in Belfast, sailed across the Atlantic, and then Junior arrived right when they got to Pennsylvania. And we don't know how Mom dealt with it, but living till almost fourscore, that sounds like a pretty good long life for someone who came to America that way. Most of these folks came to Philadelphia. There were other ports of call, New York, Charleston, but the majority of them started off in Philadelphia. And most of them came as what's known as indentured servants. This is not in any way being enslaved. That's a completely different and even much worse situation. But being indentured servant was fairly tough for some, could be pretty easy for others. You basically, someone paid for your passage across the Atlantic, and then you set up to work for them for 5, 10, 15 years. Along the way, you could make money on the side, and you would be working in someone's business, you would be working on someone's farm around about in the Philadelphia area. So it was a way that many families were able to have enough money to make it across the ocean. After being in the Philadelphia area for a while and building up enough funds, many of these folks were able to spread out and spread west in Pennsylvania, spread south into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and then spread further south into Western North Carolina. And here's a map of the Cathy family, which there are many of them in Haywood County and Jackson County today. And this shows kind of a multi-generational movement from southeastern Pennsylvania down here to Western North Carolina. Let me see if I get the years up here. The longest stop for these folks was stop number 5, where they, in 1749, they ended up in Rowan County, and they didn't leave there until, actually, I take that back, 1755. That was the longest stop. They were in Pleasant Garden in McDowell County, 1755 to 1798, so 40 years. All the other stops were only 5, 6, 7 years, and then they would move on. But many families did the same sort of migration to the western part of the state. And there were, of course, people here. And you're going to hear a lot more about them from Dr. Steer here in a few weeks. This is a map showing most of the towns. I think there's 1 or 2 that may still need to be added, but most of the towns, Cherokee towns in far western North Carolina. You'll see some names that are familiar and some names that we don't know a whole lot about. Many of these towns had a mound and were fairly large towns. I say prior to the American Revolution because during the American Revolution, there were expeditions, particularly the Rutherford expedition, that went out into Cherokee country and burned and looted and pillaged, basically trying to destroy the livelihood and the food supplies and the villages of the Cherokee. The Cherokee came off very badly after the American Revolution, and much of their former power was reduced. Um, just to place some areas here for you, Tuckasegee is just south of Cullowhee, where Western Carolina is. A little bit to the left of the out towns is Kadua, which is known as the mother town for Cherokee, and it's between Cherokee and Bryson City today. One other to remark upon is Niquossee, which is between the valley towns and the middle towns. And Niquossee, the mound, not the village, but the mound still exists, and it's right at the foot of the hill as you go up into Franklin. So you can see there was pretty substantial population out here. For the Scotch-Irish and for the other settlers who were coming from Germany and from England in particular, when they got here to the mountains, they were not necessarily having to clear out an entire forest to set up their farm. It may well have looked somewhat like this. They had to do some clearing, but some of the land was already cleared, and that was because they were taking over, in many cases, areas that Cherokee people had lived in until fairly recently. So there was somewhat clearing already. There weren't gigantic trees in the way of doing everything. But so the Scotch-Irish were able to set up farming fairly effectively and fairly efficiently. And what really helped is if people could get bottom land that looks like that in that picture from a big mural we used to have in our old Scotch-Irish exhibit at the Mountain Heritage Center. If you could get flat land, you were gonna do quite well. If you were forced to have land that was fairly steep, some of the land up the hills, you might have problems over the years with your cultivation. I've just got a series of maps here that kind of show how, in particular, the Scots-Irish moved across the 13 colonies and then the 13 states. These mark congregations, these mark churches, Presbyterian churches. And for the majority of these are Scots-Irish. There are a few Highland Scots who are also marked on here. And in particular, that group down there where there's some arrows coming into North Carolina from Wilmington, from the southern coast, those represent the Highland Scots who came in after the 45 rebellion before the American Revolution. But you can see the kind of pattern I talked about, folks coming out of Pennsylvania and going west in Pennsylvania or turning south into the Shenandoah Valley and then coming down the Great Wagon Road into Piedmont of North Carolina, at least by the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, they start going west. They go west into southwestern Virginia, up into Kentucky, and then further west into the western part of our state. And you can really see how the Cherokee were just still hanging on to the very tip of North Carolina and North Georgia. They were still hanging on even after the American Revolution. My comment there is the Presbyterians churches kind of died away, the congregations died away, and they were replaced by Baptists and Methodists. And there are several reasons for that. One primarily is that Presbyterians at that point required a college educated minister, and that became harder and harder to achieve as people moved further and further away from the coastline. Another reason may be that Baptists and particularly the Methodists had a lot better outreach, shall we say, and evangelical fervor, and they had a real plan on how to reach all these people out in the frontier, particularly the Methodists. They used camp meetings, which didn't mean that people, they could gather once a year, a couple times a year in big gatherings with tents and camping out for several days and have religious services and religious meetings. And another way was they had a lot of missionaries and people riding the circuit. One in particular who came out here many times to the mountains, Francis Asbury, And I've got a wonderful quote from him that kind of hints at the sort of the second part of my presentation, which on the transportation and the issues with transportation here in western part of the state. Asbury was in America from 1771 until he passed away in 1816. On one of these trips, just after 1800, about 1810, I believe, he says, "Friday, our troubles began at the foaming and roaring stream which hid the rocks. At Cataloochee, I walked over a log, but oh, the mountain, height after height, and 5 miles over. After crossing other streams and losing ourselves in the woods, we came in about 9 o'clock at night. What an awful day." And he was just simply talking about going from house to house, meeting with people. And it was very challenging for him to do that. So some things for the Scots-Irish changed. Their denomination changed. Some things did not change quite so much. They continued a agricultural practice known as infield and outfield. And this was quite well suited for the mountains. The idea with infield and outfield is in the infield, you do some pretty heavy cultivation. You run your garden, you do some crops. In the outfield, you do some more crops, but only for a year or so, and then you let the land lie. Then you move to another area of land and you do some more crops. So you kind of do a very slow crop rotation. Also in the outfield, you have animals. And this isn't just the outfield, this is out in the forest. And cattle and hogs did quite well in the Appalachian forest. And then once a year, those would get rounded up, and the ones you needed to slaughter, you took care of. The rest of them, you made sure their ears were clipped or they had some sort of mark on them to mark them as yours, and then you let them go again. And you'll see in this wonderful photograph, there is fencing. The point of the fencing at that point was to fence in your crops. These days, we think of fences to keep your animals in. Back then, the fences were to keep your crops safe from the animals. And this also goes back to a general idea of the commons. And this was English and Scottish thought. All the land out there does belong to people, but in some ways, all the land belongs to everybody. And if your neighbor's animals come on your property, that's okay, because your animals are probably going to go onto their property. And as long as they don't do too much damage, things are under control. That changed in the late 1800s when large agricultural interests pushed the fence laws all across North Carolina and changed this idea of the commons. And people got a little bit more antsy about their own property and stuff. So, but I love showing this picture. I love showing this to children. It shows one other agricultural thing that the settlers picked up from the Cherokee. And that is girdling trees. When you girdle a tree, you essentially take an axe and you don't chop down the tree. You don't waste all that effort. You just simply cut the bark, and you cut the top layer or so into the bark, into the tree, and that will kill the tree. And then there's no more leaves to block the sunlight. So you have sunlight, you'll have rain, you'll have the good soil, and you can have good crops. And then the tree will fall down, or you can cut it down when you need it for firewood. And so that's why this field in the foreground looks kind of a mess. There's stumps, there's mess, there's some dead trees and so forth. But that was reasonably common. And here's another picture that kind of shows the same thing. It's in the background, but there's a fenced in area with the crops. There's an area that's fallow. They've also got some hay. They did some haying possibly. And then there's just sort of dead trees scattered around. I love this picture too, with these guys posing with their team of oxen. It's a wonderful shot. Other traditions the Scots-Irish were able to keep, still working with linen, especially. This is a painting from a fair bit later, but it shows kind of the idea of communal work. That would happen from time to time, especially with barn raisings and possibly scutching bees. I've tried to work on this picture or think about this picture. Is there anybody actually doing any real work? I think the people on the far right possibly are. They're beating on the flax, and the guy on the far left, he's got a flax break, which in both cases they're trying to break down the husk of the flax. I still haven't figured out the fire or what the two people in the background on the logs are, but I do like this painting a whole lot. It's very, very interesting. So for the most part, the farmers and the families, when they arrived here in the region, their goal was self-sufficiency, of course, but they had need for trade still. They weren't just going to come out here and completely cut themselves off. And this goes to the notion of isolation. Are we truly isolated here in the mountains? Or are things just a little bit slower getting out to us? Products for market. When farmers had surplus, they would sell it, whether it be various kinds of animals, turkeys, cattle, hogs. And you're going to hear about this later in this speaker series when Representative John Adrich speaks about the Drover's Road. But it wasn't just animals that they would sell as surplus. There were crops, surplus corn might be turned into whiskey for easier transportation. The guy on the right, again, a photograph from the early 1900s, but he's showing something that people have been trading in for a long time, and that's ginseng as a medicinal. There was need for a lot of different things on a farm. Most stuff you could grow yourself or raise yourself, but people still had need for gunpowder. They had need for lead, which comes from southwestern Virginia. They had need for gun flints, which I think you could probably get from East Tennessee. They would be interested in fine goods. If they had a good year and they had a lot of products for market, they might be interested in nicer cutlery or maybe some manufactured cloth of some sort. I'm sorry, my map's a little pale, but this is from the 1830s, and it shows some of the early roads and some of the early routes into and out of the region. Buncombe County, that big, huge blob, you'll notice there's no Henderson County and no Transylvania County. And it's got the Drover's Road marked on it. That's the heaviest line from the top of Buncombe County going all the way down to the south. But coming further west, there are other roads and there are other routes out of the region where goods and products would go, from Franklin south down into North Georgia. From Murphy, I cut off Murphy on my map, but it's over on the far left. People would be traveling, taking their goods to market, possibly in vehicles like this. This is our Carolina wagon. This is probably one of the biggest artifacts we have at the Mountain Heritage Center. It was actually made in the 1880s, so it's a little after the time period I'm talking about, but wagons of this size were made to travel on mountain roads and navigate the streams like Francis Asbury was talking about, crossing over on his horseback. This particular wagon was made at the Nissen Wagon Works in Salem, or otherwise known as Old Salem today. And we think this one cost around $75 when it was first made. That was about what they were selling them for in the 1880s. And we put that dollar figure into the computer, into various of the inflation meters you can search for. And it came out to $11,000, $12,000. So the price of a halfway decent used car is what a wagon would cost you back then. Something interesting to think about. Here's another form of transportation early in the mountains, a sled, just pulled by oxen or pulled by a horse or a mule. The runners, you can just sort of see there, the runners, they would curve up. It's behind the rock, but they would curve up at the front. And this would be one way you could carry goods to around on your farm or to a store. This was a photograph taken by Horace Kephart, and right after he arrived, we think, in the Swain County area. Granville Calhoun store, Medlin. The ox sled carried my trunk. Few mountaineers have any other conveyance, summer or winter. The skins, and he's referring to what's on the wall there of the store, are bear, wildcat, coon, mink, and rattlesnake. And yes, indeed, other goods that people could take to the store for either trading or selling. And I did a little blow up of the doorway because there's this wonderful face peeking out. And there's a dog too. See if you can see the dog. I've got a letter here that gets to some of what people were getting at stores. Um, Not just the things I was talking about, like gunpowder and lead and stuff like that. This is a beautiful letter written to a Joseph Cathy who had a store near what today is Canton, going up into the mountains just a little bit closer to Bethel. Um, and let me just read it a little bit. It's from essentially from his agent down in Charleston, South Carolina. Colonel J. Cathy, dear sir, your esteemed order of the 16th just is at hand. And on the other side, you have bill of hardware ordered. We have sent the goods to the railroads consigned to Mr. A.W. Benson, Hamburg, something or other. I can't read that. And we hope they will arrive safe and open to please. We did not exactly understand what kind of gun locks you wanted, but have sent you a good rifle lock, which we hope will suit. Yours very truly. Blah, blah, blah. So it's a wonderful letter. I share this also with you to ogle at the penmanship. Maybe that's a comment on my own penmanship. On the back page, and I don't have this on the PowerPoint, but let me just read some of the things that they were sending up for Colonel Cathy's store. 6 sets of table knives and forks, half a dozen pocket knives, a half a dozen razors, set of shears, ladies' scissors, steel spectacles, knitting pins, metal vest buttons, augers, steel squares, firming chisels, paper tacks, teaspoons, tablespoons, shaving boxes, and wool cards, sad irons, etc., etc. So it's quite a substantial amount of stuff. Now, his comment about the railroad, it was only going to go so far in the railroad, and then it was going to be brought by wagon up across the mountains. But that just gives you a sense of what could be available if you had enough cash or enough goods for trade, and to go to a store to pick up. I'm going to make a huge jump here. We're going to get to the trains. Long ago, we had an exhibit at the Mountain Heritage Center that talked about tourism, and it divided it up into 3 phases: the horse and buggy phase, the train phase, and the car phase. We're not going to go into the car phase too much, but we are going to stick on the train phase for a bit. Things went really well, I would say, economically in Western North Carolina until the Civil War. The region was actually, and you'll hear again about this more with the Drovers Road program, kind of a breadbasket for the rest of the South due to so much plantation-based agriculture that didn't allow for a lot of food production for the enslaved people and for the rest of the people living in the South. Western North Carolina produced a lot of foodstuffs, and that was exported out of the region to other parts of the South. With the Civil War and the collapse of the economy all across the South, Western North Carolina, there was not a lot of money coming in. And then compounding that, the railroad took a really long time to arrive, for a variety of reasons. So it wasn't until 1880, the first passenger train, 15 years after the Civil War, first passenger train arrives in Asheville. 1883, it gets to Canton, or what we know of as Canton today. Whoops, let me go back. 1889 gets to what we know of today as Silva. And then 1894, you could ride from Asheville all the way to Murphy, and you could get on a connecting train and go on to Chattanooga, which must have been a fun ride. And here's a map from 1900, a little bit after the railroad opened, that shows the main route through the mountains west into Cherokee County down there on the lower left. There were some other trains, obviously. There were a lot of logging trains that got started up shortly after this map was produced. And maybe there were some already there that just don't make it onto this map. But yeah, big note too, this railroad was constructed using convict labor, which was essentially a way of basically re-enslaving people after the Civil War to using the convict system. There's a lot of discussion right now about a possible memorial marker in the Asheville area to mark the building of the railroad up from Old Fort. There could well be some sort of memorial that also takes place or gets put in near Dillsboro, which is just west of me here in Silva. There was a horrible accident as the railroad came through and a number of convicts were drowned in the Tuckasegee River during the construction process. 19, I believe. So there's a lot of memorialization that needs to take place to recognize the work that went into making this railroad possible. And sorry, this map's a little bit harder to see, but I do love it. It shows again the railroad, but it's the post routes. These are showing all the different post offices, and it is actually giving miles between post offices. So it gives you just a hint of all the different communities that were all across the mountains here. It also gives you a very good idea of where the high mountains were, because there aren't a lot of, there's not a lot of post offices between Jackson and Haywood County because there's some really tall mountains in the way, or between Haywood and Transylvania. And I cut it off, but north of Buncombe up towards Yancey County, there's another big empty spot as well. So it's really neat map. So if you can ever get a postal route map and have a good look at it, either online or in your hand, it's wonderful to look at, and also to see some of the communities that still exist and some communities that have basically disappeared and aren't really there anymore, except for maybe a crossroads in some backcountry roads. So it's a wonderful look. And it also hints at the connectivities, or the connectivity between the different communities. So let me move on. The railroad brought a lot of things to the region. It obviously brought people, but it began at tourist. It really began the tourist movement as sort of broader than just simply in parts of Buncombe County and parts of Henderson County, which have been active tourist destinations well before the Civil War. The railroad really opened up the rest of the region. This is a picture, and hidden in the trees there is the Balsam Mountain Inn, which some of you may be very familiar with. It's still open today. I think they had a name change, but it's the old Balsam Mountain Inn. The railroad itself is down kind of where the road is, where the sandy road is. I don't know why it looks like they almost erased it out of this colorized photograph. The other thing I'm sort of hinting at here is with this guy in his wagon. He's either got a whole bunch of logs that he's going to turn into fence rails or strange firewood, or it's possibly going to be acid wood. It's possibly logs from a chestnut tree that he's going to sell on to a place like this, which was, because of the railroad, could now become a big business, a big industrial sort of business in Western North Carolina. And there were several of these around the region. This is the one that was down in Silva. The mill is still going today, but now it's a paper mill, and it was a paper mill beginning in the early 1950s, I believe. But yeah, this is the Armor Tanning Company. And on the left-hand side of the picture, to the left of those sheds, there's just piles and piles of logs, and it's chestnut logs that would be broken up and chipped and put into a giant vat to make a very acidic liquor. And that's what they would put the hides, leather hides into, to be tanned, to be basically cured. So probably an incredibly smelly process, possibly somewhat dangerous too, but something that could take place here in the mountains because of the railroad coming in and out. And one other thought on the railroad is now the people who were still farming, they were now having to compete with folks in the Midwest and the Great Plains for farm crops, but they could compete somewhat. This is in Woodrow, which is back to between Bethel and Canton. And they're supposedly loading apples up into the train, and looks like they've got some wood as well. So wonderful picture, but it shows the reach of the train and the power and the ability for farmers to make a go of it, in a sense. So in just over 100 years, we went from something that looks like that on the left, that picture may be a little stereotypical, but kind of that idea, to something on the right there, and that's downtown Waynesville um, in the early 1900s. Cars for hire. Would you take one of those cars on a rutted mountain road, an unpaved mountain road? I don't know. I might. It might be kind of fun. Okay. I want to thank y'all for bearing with me. And if I can break out of this, I would love to entertain your questions. Let's see if I can do this. Yes, I would love to entertain your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. We had actually quite a few questions come in. I logged some of these while we were presenting, but the first question, I think if we go chronologically, it might work better, but the first person asked, were Highland Scots also Presbyterians?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And that was that map. There was that little bit of Presbyterianism that was coming into the Fayetteville area, especially into Cumberland County in sort of southeastern North Carolina, and those were Highlanders, definitely.
Okay. Next question is, why did the Scotch Irish come through Shenandoah, through the valley into North Carolina instead of via the coast like the Highlanders did?
I think part of that may have to do with North Carolina just did not have a good port at all at this time. Wilmington was halfway decent, but any real ocean going business was probably going to be going through Charleston or, like I said, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. And for some reason, Philadelphia just ended up being the one where there was a lot of immigration through. Why people came down the Shenandoah Valley, I think sometimes people felt that they were going to make one move and just stop, but it turned out that maybe that wasn't going to be the case, and they could keep going, and then maybe they could acquire more land if they kept going a little bit further south and a little bit further west. And then also there's that multi-generational part. If one family stops, the son, the wife, whomever, maybe they're the ones that are making that next step in the desire to have new land.
Yeah. Well, okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in now. Let's see, the next one, somebody asked about your 1839 map and how many counties were on that, or how many counties there were at the time.
A lot. I don't know how many North Carolina had at that time, but it was Buncombe, Macon, and Haywood. Cherokee was just about to be formed. Jackson was formed in 1850, and then right before the Civil War, Henderson, Transylvania, and Clay were formed. Graham and Swain are actually, I believe, post-Civil War. So in the 1870s is when they were formed.
Yeah. And then Avery didn't form until, what was it, 1900, I think, or sometime very, very late.
Yeah.
Okay. Someone asked, why was Bryson City first called Charleston?
I think it's, I don't know for sure, but I think it is a connection back to Charleston, South Carolina. Bryson's a local name. There's so many Brysons, and that was a name that it was changed to.
Yeah. Okay.
You should go to the Swain County Heritage Museum. They'll tell you all about it.
Somebody asked about, I love this question. What are some of the sources for these maps?
Well, the railroad map came from the 1900s. Railroad map came from the Library of Congress, but we borrowed it at Western. The Special Collections created a travel website, and I should really share that with you. It's really interesting. It talks about towns and roads, and it draws a nice comparison between, especially the railroads and the early highway with the automobiles. And it has a nice little sampling of lots of different quotes about the towns and people going to towns and what they found when they got there, like Canton and Clyde and Waynesville, and a lot of towns that don't exist anymore, like Medlin, which got flooded out when Fontana Lake was built.
Yeah, let's see. Somebody complimented your artifact selection. When did somebody asked, when the first settlers moved in and took over Indian villages and land, was this a gradual process or through direct military conflicts over a short period?
I think the easiest way to say is, unfortunately, the Cherokee tried their best, but they had a hard time, obviously due to disease and just pressure. They were on the losing side of two wars. The end of the French and Indian War brought them into direct conflict with American and British forces, and they didn't do too well there. And then in the American Revolution, the British were seen as their protectors. And so they sided with the loyalists, with the British cause, and they suffered greatly for it. After that, it was just a series of treaties that slowly reduced their land. And then it culminated, of course, in the 1830s in the removal. But there were some that were able to hang on, and that's the genesis of the Eastern Band. And those are folks who actually had been able to purchase their own land. And so they could say they owned property in North Carolina. They were not wards of the United States. They were not, Indians who could be moved. And that was the majority of the people living in North Georgia and some in North Carolina. They were able to be forced off their land and sent to Oklahoma.
Yeah. I wanted to add with that, there's a really great map from 1884, I believe. It's from the Secretary of Indian Affairs. And it shows the gradual treaties the federal government, the U.S. government made with the Cherokee. And so it's just, you see steady further encroachment and little other pieces chipped off. Somebody asked, did they speak the Irish language, Gaelic, when they arrived in America, and did they bring some of that to Western North Carolina?
I think they brought a lot of the music and stories that were common to the British Isles. I would hesitate to know too much about the language. I tend to think not, just because, again, these are lowland Scots, and also some of them are English before they even went to Ireland. So there was probably a lot more English in them than Gaelic. And living in Ireland, a lot of them actually lived in kind of real enclosures and fortified areas, and tried as hard as they could not to mix too much with the Catholic folks. So there may not have been the kind of interaction that we think. So I hesitate to say they didn't speak Gaelic, but all right, I'll go out on a limb. I don't really think they spoke Gaelic too much. But that's one that needs more research by me.
Okay. Let's see, somebody asked, was there much early immigration to the region from other places, Germany, France?
No, France, not so much at all. The French, of course, had come in the 16 and 1700s, mostly to Canada or to the West Indies, places in the West Indies. But for some reason, there weren't people leaving France as much as going to, as leaving parts of Germany and England and Scotland and Ireland. I don't know why that at all.
Yeah. Okay. This next guest asked two questions, and I think both of these are really, really helpful. This one's a little bit bigger. She asked what criteria was used to decide who was to move from Scotland to Ireland.
I think there was some, put it mildly, I think there was some arm twisting going on. I think there was opportunity. Why don't you move over there? You can rent a farm, you can do some work for us, and you'll make some money. I don't think it was a forced migration per se. from Scotland to Ireland, but there was probably some incentive and also some coercion that went on. But then coming to America, that was choice. The English did not necessarily want these people leaving, even though the economics were not that great. They wanted them to stay there.
Okay. The next question with that it relates to transportation, and it's were rivers used in Western North Carolina for transportation, the Little or the French Broad?
Yes, and I wish I knew a bit more about that. There were some boats. There were some steamboats, I think, in the late 1800s, especially. I think before the settlers arrived, the Cherokee used the rivers greatly with canoes and saw them as real avenues of transport. That you saw probably in that one map that a lot of their larger settlements were in the river valleys. And that's obviously flat land, helps their cultivation, help their communities grow nice and strong. But part of that also is that those really good rivers, and at certain times of the year, they are fairly navigable, especially with the canoe. Laterally, I don't think quite as much, not until, yeah, I don't think once the settlers got here, the rivers were not used quite as much. It was just early bad roads.
All right. I was getting into some of the bigger, broader questions here. I guess ask, about the actual acquisition of land. She wants to know who were settlers acquiring land from, and who was selling, and why were they selling lands?
Land was being purchased before the American Revolution by speculators. When the governments would open up certain areas, they'd have a treaty with the Cherokee or other Native American tribes that would create a certain area that the government would have, and then people could buy that. But it always ended up that fairly wealthy people would buy that, but then they would sell it off in parcels to other folks. After the American Revolution, because the United States at that time was incredibly cash poor, they had a lot of debts, especially to the soldiers. So they were selling. They were giving soldiers, instead of money, they were giving them land, and the land was going to be in the western frontier region. And it was the same thing. The government held the land, and then they could sell it off to whomever they wanted. So a lot of the land in Western North Carolina was acquired by veterans, and they either turned around and sold it to someone else, or they, in some cases, they actually did go out there with their families and try to settle.
All right, this is a more open-ended question, but someone wanted to know if you can discuss a little bit more about slavery in Western North Carolina.
Yeah, it's a great topic. There were quite a number of enslaved people that came to the region. I think it's sort of general ideas. There were not plantations, obviously, here in the mountains. There were not the really large-scale farms that required a lot of people power to man them. So instead, enslaved people were working on farms, but also doing all sorts of different tasks. There was some mining. There was some light industrial stuff like blacksmithing. Towards Asheville and Hendersonville, there were people who were working in the sort of early tourist industries like inns and hotels. So it's generally considered more varied of an experience for the various folks who were enslaved and brought here to the region. There were some large slave owners. The Love family is one that comes up, that there were people in Haywood and Macon and Jackson County who were Loves and held had a lot of enslaved people. William Holland Thomas is another famous individual from the Jackson County area, and he's exactly like one I'm thinking of. He had all sorts of different business interests, and he had his enslaved people working in all sorts of different types of work. So it's multifaceted. It's still an enslaved experience, which is tough.
Let's see, it's 7:25. Want to do a couple more fast, and then we'll go through our wrap up. But okay, the next question was referencing the postal map that you showed. How many, or they want to know how small were some of the communities. Were these just 2 or 3 person communities, or did you need 10 to 12 families to be, a post stop on the map?
I don't know what the criteria is. That's a great question. The way I hear about it is some of these places were tiny. They were just literally a building at a crossroads. And there were quite a number of families living around. But how many of them would have really said, would they have associated themselves with that post office, or would they associate themselves by living up the particular creek? That's one thing I've learned being here, is that people, they talk about being from a county, they can talk about being from a particular town or community, and quite often they'll talk about themselves as being from a particular creek valley. So how that all interrelates to a particular post office, that's a great question. They were definitely seen as community centers, though, and places for people to visit. And, especially after the railroad gets here and there's a lot more goods that folks can buy, the post office would have the Sears catalog or the Montgomery Ward's catalog that you could go down and look at and send off a postal order to buy anything, literally anything. But that's definitely a late 1800s, early 1900s phenomenon.
All right, so let's see, we'll do just a couple more fast. Sorry, we're probably not going to get to everybody. Like I said, we tried to get everybody answered. Somebody wanted to know a little bit more about the Creek people that were here before the Cherokee, and where can they learn more about the Creeks?
I don't know. The Cherokee talk about the Cherokee and their ancestors. That's how they term it. They don't often bring in the Creek as being part of that. And if you look at some of those old maps and you look at the strength of the Cherokee and the size of their influence, they ranged in influence up into what we think of as today as Kentucky and all of Western North Carolina, down into North Georgia and upstate South Carolina, and then far into Northern Alabama and East Tennessee, is what they would say their tribal strength was. That's a good question, though.
All right, let's do one last question. I'm trying to see what, I guess maybe this is the best last question, but were there any other family names besides the Cathys that come to mind? This person has family and ancestral relations in Western North Carolina and Tennessee, so they want to know about some of the other prominent family names.
Yeah, there's some great ones. It's a challenge in some ways to parse out these Scots-Irish names, because in many ways they're very close to the English names. So you're never quite sure, if you start just with a name, which, and you go all the way back to the old country, which way the branches are going to go. Hooper is one, and sometimes you hear that as Hooper. McDowell, obviously. Kathy, Patton. Some of y'all being in Asheville have probably heard of Patton before. That's a Scotch-Irish family. Vance is a Scotch-Irish family. Some more out our way, Kathy. Cabe is probably shortened from McCabe. Cowan, again, is probably shortened from McCowan. Trying to think of some more. Well, anyway, there's a lot of them. You need we don't do phone books anymore, but you should pick up a Haywood or a Jackson County phone book and just start having to look through that. And I think some names will start popping out at you as being from sort of the England, Ireland area. Great questions. Thank y'all very much. Appreciate that.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for a really interesting and good overview of all the things that we're going to continue to talk about even further in some of these other programs. So I hope that was really helpful for everybody. And I want to thank also everybody for coming out and participating tonight. I'm going to give you a little shameless plug here fast, but let's see. I'll find a tab screen I'm looking for. Again, so Peter is with the Mountain Heritage Center. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what they do, the website, the Mountain Heritage Center at Western Carolina University. There's a full range of information about exhibits and things that they do there. So I highly encourage you to check that out. And then also, if you were interested in tonight's program, you might be interested in some of our other programming at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. We have coming up March 11th, a presentation on a recently published book on DuPont forest history. And then just a few days later, we have the first hike of the year. So we do more than virtual programs. We do have some hikes interspersed also that go in depth and actually explore some of the places we cover. And then, of course, the next event in this series, the Intro to Western North Carolina series, as Peter mentioned, Dr. Ben Steer of Western Carolina, he's presenting on Cherokee Mountain and Village sites on March 25th. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, make sure that you go ahead and get registered. We look forward to seeing you. Well, Peter, before we head out, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, I will. Is there a way I can share a link or something real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do we do a share screen, or what would be the best thing? Send it to you in the chat?
Yeah, just share.
Okay. Do that real quick. This is there was a few questions about this that may help. This is a website that Hunter Library, the library at Western, created a number of years ago. And I got some of the information and saw some of the maps I liked from it. But again, it's what I mentioned earlier, especially with the difference between the trains and sort of the early highways, cars, motoring through the mountains. So travel in Western North Carolina. If you Google up travel in Western North Carolina, Hunter Library or Western Carolina University, it'll send you to this site. And I highly encourage y'all to check it out. A lot of good stuff there. Thanks again. Thanks again for hosting me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you all for tuning in. As I noted, you'll receive the link to the recording of the program shortly. And we also have kind of a favor to ask of you. Also, we'll send out a short survey attached to that. So if you can take 2 or 3 quick minutes and just fill out a survey, that helps us keep bringing you great programs like this and keep presenting interesting subjects. So again, thank you all very much for tuning in. I look forward to the next event and wish you all a good night.